The annual academic conference was a gathering of the brightest young minds in the country, a place where intellectuals debated, challenged conventional wisdom, and sought to prove their superiority. It was an environment where traditional beliefs were often scrutinized and dismantled in favor of progressive thought, where professors relished the opportunity to assert their dominance over students eager to prove their worth. Among these scholars stood Barron Trump, a young man who had earned his place at the conference through sheer academic excellence. Yet, despite his achievements, whispers followed him wherever he went. Some attendees claimed he was only present because of his last name, dismissing his intelligence before he even had the chance to speak. What they did not realize was that by the end of the day, Barron would not only silence every doubt about his intellect, but also stand his ground against one of the most outspoken intellectuals in the room, proving that he was far more than just a famous name. At the heart of the conference stood Professor Nathaniel Carter, a renowned academic known for his razor-sharp wit and even sharper tongue. He had built his reputation on intellectual battles, taking pride in dismantling traditional values, particularly religious beliefs, in front of eager audiences. To Carter, faith was an outdated concept, something to be ridiculed and discarded in favor of scientific reasoning and rational thought. His lectures were not merely educational, they were grand performances, carefully crafted to expose what he saw as the flaws and contradictions in religious ideology. He saw himself as a champion of logic, a warrior against the so-called ignorance of faith. Students admired him, not just for his intelligence but for his ability to humiliate those who dared to challenge his views. His debates were more than discussions. They were intellectual gladiator matches. And today, he was preparing for another victory. As students filled the grand lecture hall that morning, an eager energy crackled in the air. They had come to witness Carter in action, expecting another masterful takedown of those foolish enough to defend outdated beliefs. The professor took his place at the podium, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the room with an air of confidence. "Let's address the elephant in the room," he declared, his voice laced with amusement. Folding his arms across his chest, he smirked as his gaze swept across the audience before briefly settling on Barron Trump. "Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief," he continued. "In simpler terms, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, though some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Behind him, a massive screen flickered to life, displaying a sharply declining graph. "See this?" Carter gestured dramatically. "This is what happens to religious belief as IQ and education levels rise. Fascinating, isn't it?" He let the question linger for effect before adding, almost offhandedly, "Though I suppose some people's family traditions," he cast another pointed glance at Barron, "make it harder for them to accept basic cognitive development." A few scattered laughs echoed through the room, but for the most part the audience remained silent. At the back of the room, Professor Henry Wallace, a respected faculty member, watched the exchange with growing concern. He had seen Carter be provocative before, but this time it felt different. This was not an academic debate, it was personal. Carter continued, his voice dripping with intellectual superiority. "You know what I find truly remarkable?" he asked, gesturing toward the room with exaggerated theatrics. "We have some of the brightest young minds in America gathered here today. Future scientists, leaders, thinkers. Yet I guarantee some of you still cling to these primitive beliefs, unable to break free from your cognitive limitations." A few students chuckled nervously while others looked down at their desks, avoiding eye contact. Through it all, Barron Trump remained perfectly still. His jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, but his expression remained calm. Unlike the other students who either laughed uneasily or looked away, Barron did neither. Instead, he met Carter's gaze head-on, unwavering. Something about that steady, unshaken composure seemed to irritate the professor even further. Carter narrowed his eyes and leaned forward slightly, removing his glasses and placing them on the podium. "Tell me," he challenged, his voice laced with sarcasm, "what does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they still believe in an invisible sky daddy in 2025? when their cognitive development is so stunted that they need a fairy tale to explain the world. His eyes locked onto Barron. Perhaps, he added, his smirk widening, some of our more politically connected students would care to enlighten us. The tension in the room was suffocating. Some students held their breath, their eyes darting between Carter and Barron, realizing that this had gone beyond a lecture. It was now a direct challenge. Professor Carter had issued his intellectual assault, and the audience expected Barron to crumble under the pressure like so many before him. But no one, not even Carter himself, was prepared for what happened next. Barron Trump stood up. A murmur spread through the room. He did not rush, nor did he falter. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and measured. "Actually, Professor," Barron said, cutting through the thick silence, "I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." The room fell silent. Carter's smirk wavered ever so slightly. What had begun as an attempt to publicly ridicule a student was now turning into something else entirely. The intellectual battle Carter had so confidently instigated had just begun, but this time, the outcome would not be what he expected. Professor Nathaniel Carter had spent decades refining his craft, an intellectual warrior who prided himself on tearing down traditional beliefs, particularly religious faith. His lectures were more than academic discussions. They were performances, carefully orchestrated to dismantle any notion that faith and reason could coexist. He thrived on the tension, the hushed anticipation before he delivered a cutting remark, the nervous laughter that followed his sharp wit, the uncomfortable shifting of students who had once believed in something greater than themselves but now found their convictions under siege. To Carter, faith was a relic of an unenlightened past, something clung to by those too afraid or too unintelligent to embrace the cold, hard truth of scientific reason. And today, standing before a hall filled with some of the most promising young minds in America, he had his next target in sight. Barron Trump, a name that carried weight, sat among the students, calm and composed. Carter had been aware of his presence from the moment he walked into the room, sensing the buzz around him. He had heard the whispers, the skepticism from some who questioned why Barron was even here, the silent expectations from others waiting to see if he would prove himself. But to Carter, Barron was just another young man weighed down by inherited beliefs, another mind yet to be freed from the shackles of religious dogma, and today he would make an example of him. Carter adjusted his glasses and turned to the large screen behind him, where a sharply declining graph illuminated the room. He let the image speak for itself before addressing the students. "Let's talk about intelligence and belief," he began, his voice carrying an air of authority. "Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious faith. In simpler terms, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies." His gaze flickered toward Barron, a deliberate pause hanging in the air. Of course, for some, family traditions make it harder to accept basic cognitive development. The room was silent for a moment before a few students chuckled uneasily. Others glanced at Barron, waiting to see how he would react. Carter continued, stepping away from the podium and pacing slightly, his confidence unwavering. "You know what I find fascinating?" he asked, gesturing toward the audience. "We have some of the most brilliant young minds in the country here today. Future scientists, innovators, thinkers. And yet, despite all of our advancements in neuroscience, psychology, and quantum mechanics, some people still cling to these primitive beliefs. They resist progress, preferring to remain in the comfort of mythology rather than face reality." He turned back toward Barron, his smirk widening. "And I suppose, for some, that's understandable. After all, when your worldview has been shaped by political privilege rather than empirical reasoning, breaking free from that conditioning can be challenging." A few more students laughed, some nervously, some more openly. But Barron did not react. He did not shift uncomfortably or avert his gaze. Instead, he remained perfectly still, watching Carter with an expression that betrayed no emotion. This, for some reason, only seemed to fuel the professor's desire to push further. Carter leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the podium. "So, tell me," he continued, his voice thick with sarcasm, "what does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they still believe in an invisible sky daddy in 2025? when their cognitive development is so stunted that they need fairy tales to explain the world. His eyes locked onto Barron, waiting for a reaction. Perhaps, he added, his smirk never fading, some of our more politically connected students would care to enlighten us? The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Some students held their breath, others exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew what was happening. This was not just a lecture anymore. It was a direct challenge, a public attempt to humiliate a student who had yet to even open his mouth. At the back of the room, Professor Henry Wallace, an older and well-respected faculty member, watched the exchange unfold with a growing sense of unease. He had seen Carter provoke students before, had witnessed his relentless takedowns of those who dared to defend religious beliefs, but something about today felt different. This was not merely a debate of ideas. It was a deliberate effort to undermine and ridicule. Carter, however, was enjoying himself. His lectures were always well received, and he had no reason to believe today would be any different. He was used to students fumbling under pressure, to them stammering out weak defenses of their faith before ultimately conceding defeat. That was how these battles usually went. Faith was dismantled, and reason prevailed. But as he looked at Barron Trump, sitting there with an almost unnerving stillness, Carter felt the first flicker of something unexpected: doubt. Barron had not laughed, had not scowled, had not looked away. He had not given Carter the satisfaction of appearing even remotely shaken. He was watching the professor, not with fear or insecurity, but with something far more unsettling: calm confidence. It was a reaction Carter was not accustomed to. Students either reacted with nervousness or anger. They either shrank in embarrassment or lashed out defensively. But Barron did neither. He simply waited. For the first time that morning, Carter felt a slight shift in the room. He could sense it in the way some students were now watching Barron rather than him, in the way Professor Wallace leaned forward slightly, intrigued by what might come next. And then, just as Carter was preparing to drive his point home, Barron Trump stood up. A murmur spread through the audience, low but unmistakable. No one had expected this. The students had assumed that Barron would either remain silent and let the attack pass, or attempt a weak, defensive response. But the way he moved, the deliberate, measured way he rose from his seat, suggested something entirely different. He was not intimidated. He was not flustered. He was not backing down. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and unwavering. "Actually, Professor," Barron said, his words cutting through the thick silence of the room, "I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." The effect was immediate. The room, once buzzing with nervous energy, fell completely still. Carter's smirk faltered, only slightly, but enough for those paying attention to notice. What had begun as an attempt to publicly ridicule a student was now turning into something else entirely. Barron Trump had accepted the challenge, and in that moment, everyone realized that this intellectual battle was far from over. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation, as Barron Trump stood, his expression calm and unwavering. Unlike many students before him who had crumbled under Professor Carter's relentless intellectual attacks, Barron did not fidget, did not break eye contact, did not give the professor the satisfaction of seeing even the slightest hesitation. Instead, he met Carter's gaze with quiet confidence, as if he had been waiting for this moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, controlled, and deliberate. "Actually, Professor," he said, his words cutting through the stillness, "I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." His tone was not defensive, nor was it aggressive. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what he was about to do. A flicker of amusement crossed Carter's face. He had played this game before, dismantling students who dared challenge him. He gestured theatrically, inviting Barron to continue. "Well, well," Carter said, his smirk returning. "Young Mr. Trump wants to educate us about intellectual capacity. Please, enlighten us. Tell us how your God fits into the modern world of quantum physics and artificial intelligence." A few students chuckled, expecting a swift and brutal takedown, but Barron remained unfazed. He did not take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and replied, "First, I find it interesting that someone who prides himself on intellectual rigor is making the assumption that belief in God equates to a lack of intelligence. That's not science, Professor. That's bias. The room fell completely still. Carter's smirk wavered, just slightly, but enough for those paying attention to notice. Professor Wallace, sitting at the back, leaned in, intrigued. Barron took a step forward, his voice steady and clear. Second, if you truly valued intellectual pursuit, you would know that some of the greatest scientific minds in history, Newton, Max Planck, Francis Collins, acknowledged the role of a higher power in the universe. He paused, letting his words settle. Einstein himself once said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." A murmur spread through the room. Carter's expression hardened. "Ah," he scoffed, "so now we're cherry-picking historical figures? Newton? Planck? Are you seriously bringing ancient history into this discussion? What's next? Are you going to tell us God is a magician?" He chuckled, expecting the audience to join him, but this time the laughter was sparse. Something had shifted. Barron remained composed. "You claim to respect reason, yet you dismiss historical precedent when it doesn't suit your argument," he said, his voice sharp but calm. "And let's talk about your graph, Professor," he continued, turning slightly toward the large screen, still displaying the declining correlation between intelligence and religious belief. "You claim that as IQ and education rise, religious belief declines, but correlation does not equal causation. That's a fundamental statistical error, one that someone of your academic standing should know better than to make." Students who had been smirking moments before now looked at each other, some nodding in silent agreement. Carter clenched his jaw. Barron wasn't done. "And finally, let's talk about faith itself," he said, stepping forward. "Faith isn't the opposite of intelligence. It takes faith to believe in human rights, in justice, in love. These are not scientifically quantifiable concepts, yet they shape our world. The real question, Professor, isn't whether faith and intelligence can coexist. It's whether a man so committed to his own intellectual pride can admit that he might not have all the answers." The lecture hall was dead silent. Carter's smirk was gone. Professor Wallace sat back in his chair, a small, knowing smile on his face. Carter cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Well," he muttered, adjusting his glasses, "let's move on." But everyone in that room knew Barron Trump had just won a battle no one expected him to fight. A few nervous chuckles echoed through the hall, but the usual smugness on Carter's face had faded. "Oh, please," Carter interrupted, waving a dismissive hand, attempting to regain control. "Spare us the Sunday school sermon. I've spent 30 years studying cognitive development. Are you suggesting you know better?" Barron's response was immediate. "I'm suggesting," he said, his voice steady, "that your bias is showing, Professor. You claim to follow evidence, yet you ignore the countless brilliant minds, both historical and contemporary, who have reconciled faith and reason." Carter scoffed, shaking his head. "You're twisting things. Science has explained everything that religion once claimed was divine intervention." "Has it?" Barron asked smoothly, his expression unwavering. "Then perhaps you can explain consciousness, Professor. The origin of life itself. Why the universe's physical constants are so precisely tuned for life to exist." Carter's jaw clenched. "Those are just gaps in our current knowledge." "Exactly," Barron interjected, his tone unwavering. "Gaps in our knowledge. Yet, you're so certain that nothing divine could possibly exist within those gaps. Isn't that, in itself, a form of blind faith?" The audience was completely captivated now. Students who had initially laughed at Carter's mockery were now nodding along with Barron's points. Carter's face reddened, his fingers tightening around the podium. "When you mock faith, Professor," Barron continued, stepping forward slightly, "you're not just mocking me or my beliefs. You're mocking the billions of people throughout history who have found meaning, purpose, and profound truth in their relationship with God, including, I might add, many of the scientists whose shoulders you stand on." The professor's composure was cracking. Students who had been smirking earlier were now watching Barron with growing respect. He let the silence stretch before delivering his final challenge. "So, tell me, Professor," Barron said, his voice taking on an edge of challenge, "what's more indicative of stunted cognitive development? Believing in a higher power or believing that mockery is a substitute for actual intellectual discourse. The room held its breath. Professor Carter opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. His fingers tightened around the podium. Barron let the weight of the moment settle before delivering his final argument, the one that would leave Professor Carter wishing he had never started this confrontation. "I'll tell you why you're threatened, Professor," Barron continued, his voice still calm but deliberate, "because deep down you know that your entire worldview rests on a fundamental contradiction." Carter narrowed his eyes, forcing himself to ask, "What contradiction?" "You claim to follow evidence and reason," Barron said, "yet you've made an absolute negative claim that God cannot exist. Any true scientist knows that proving a negative is impossible, so your certainty isn't scientific at all, it's dogmatic." A murmur rippled through the audience. Carter's face paled slightly. Barron wasn't finished. Further, Barron continued, "You mock people for finding meaning in faith, while you've turned your own atheism into a kind of religion. You preach it with the same fervor that you criticize in believers. The only difference is that you've replaced God with your own intellect." Then Barron delivered the final blow. "But here's the most telling contradiction," he paused, holding Carter's gaze. "You claim that believing in God is a sign of lower intelligence. Yet standing here today, you are unable to counter even basic theological arguments from a student." The room was utterly still. Professor Carter's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in his career, he had no response. The moment Barron Trump finished speaking, the energy in the room shifted. What had started as yet another one-sided intellectual beatdown orchestrated by Professor Carter had taken an unexpected turn. The confident, dismissive smirk that had previously dominated Carter's face was now gone, replaced by something far less certain. The usual pattern of his debates, where faith was mocked, religious students stumbled over their words, and the audience laughed along, had been broken. The students who had once chuckled at his jabs now sat in silence, their eyes darting between Carter and Barron, fully aware that this was no longer a routine humiliation. For the first time in years, Carter was on the defensive, and he knew it. Barron, however, remained calm. His posture had not changed, his voice had not wavered, and most importantly, he had not resorted to emotion or anger. Instead, he had used pure logic, exposing flaws in Carter's reasoning with the same level of intellectual precision that the professor had long used to dominate his debates. And Carter, who was used to debating students who buckled under pressure, now found himself facing an opponent who was not only prepared, but unshaken. Carter cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "it seems young Mr. Trump has done his research. But let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here." He turned back to the audience, attempting to re-establish his command of the room. "Faith, by its very nature, is belief without evidence. Science, on the other hand, is based on empirical proof. To claim that the two can coexist is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of knowledge itself." He clasped his hands together, leaning forward slightly, as if resetting the stage. "So tell me, Barron, where is your evidence for God?" Barron did not hesitate. "Where is your evidence against him?" he countered, his voice steady. "You claim to follow reason, yet you make an absolute statement about something you cannot prove. That is not science, Professor. That is ideology." A murmur rippled through the audience. Carter's smirk twitched slightly as he recognized the clever inversion of his usual tactics. He had spent years demanding proof of God's existence, never expecting a student to turn the same logic back on him. "Ah," Carter said, regaining a bit of his confidence, "the classic shifting of the burden of proof. You see, Barron, the person making the claim is the one responsible for providing evidence." Barron nodded. "Exactly, Professor. And your claim is that belief in God is irrational, but you have provided no evidence to support that assertion, only a dismissive attitude and a flawed statistical correlation." He gestured toward the graph, still lingering on the screen. "If you are going to argue that faith is a cognitive weakness, then you must also explain why some of the greatest scientific minds in history did not share your view. Were Newton and Planck intellectually inferior? Was Einstein limited in his reasoning when he acknowledged that science and religion were not in conflict, but complementary? Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew that dismissing these historical figures outright would make him appear arrogant, but conceding that they were intelligent would undermine his previous assertion that faith and intelligence were incompatible. He was trapped. Meanwhile, the students in the audience were beginning to see the cracks in Carter's arguments. They had watched him dismantle believers before, but never had they seen him struggle to respond. The ones who had laughed at his earlier jabs were now listening intently, reevaluating assumptions they had taken for granted. Even Professor Wallace, sitting at the back of the room, had leaned forward slightly, his eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction. He had long warned Carter that his arrogance would one day be his downfall, and now it appeared that day had come. Barron pressed on, seizing the momentum. "Let's talk about faith itself," he said. "You claim it is belief without evidence, yet you put faith in many things science has yet to fully explain. Consciousness, the origin of life, the fine-tuning of the universe. These are phenomena that, by your own admission, remain mysteries. So tell me, Professor, do you believe that science will one day explain these things?" Carter exhaled sharply. "Of course," he said, his irritation barely concealed. "Science is an evolving field, constantly uncovering new truths. Just because we don't have all the answers now doesn't mean we won't in the future." Barron nodded again. "Exactly. And that is a belief in the unseen. That is faith." The silence that followed was deafening. Students exchanged glances, realizing that Barron had just flipped the entire argument on its head. Carter, who had built his career on mocking faith, had just admitted to possessing his own version of it. Carter's jaw tightened. "That's a false equivalence," he said quickly. "Scientific faith is based on evidence leading us in a direction, not blind devotion to an ancient text." Barron's response was immediate. "And yet, you ridicule those who believe in a higher power despite historical, philosophical, and experiential evidence that billions of people have recognized throughout history. You call faith irrational, while expecting others to blindly accept your personal certainty that nothing exists beyond what science has currently measured." He took a step closer. "So I ask you again, Professor, who is truly exercising blind faith?" Carter's hands clenched around the edges of the podium. He had never struggled this much in a debate with a student. He had expected Barron Trump to fumble, to stutter out a weak defense of his beliefs. But instead, he had found himself confronted by an opponent who was not only unshaken, but methodical. And worst of all, Barron was not just winning the debate, he was changing the room. Carter could see it in the faces of his students. The confidence in their previous assumptions was fading. The easy laughter at the expense of religious belief had been replaced with contemplation. Barron was doing something far more dangerous than simply defending his faith. He was forcing people to think. And for the first time in his career, Nathaniel Carter realized that he might be the one on the wrong side of the debate. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Professor Carter, once the dominant figure in every intellectual debate he led, was now visibly struggling. The students, who had initially entered the lecture hall expecting another predictable dismantling of religious thought, now sat on the edge of their seats, watching in disbelief as Barron Trump systematically turned the professor's own arguments against him. What had started as a public humiliation of a student had transformed into something entirely different. An unexpected and unprecedented intellectual counteroffensive. Carter, a man accustomed to tearing down his opponents with sharp rhetoric and cutting wit, now found himself unable to regain control of the room. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. Barron, however, remained poised. He had not raised his voice, nor had he resorted to emotion. He simply stood firm, his words precise, his logic undeniable. "You claim that faith is nothing more than a crutch for those unwilling to accept reality," Barron continued, his voice even and unwavering. "But let's examine that claim, Professor. What is faith, really? You mock those who believe in a higher power, yet you yourself believe in things that science has yet to fully explain. Consciousness, the origin of life, the fine-tuning of the universe. You accept that these are great unknowns, yet you have faith that science will one day provide the answers. That, by definition, is belief in the unseen. So tell me, Professor, how is your faith in the eventual omniscience of science any different from religious faith? Carter's fingers tightened around the podium. He inhaled sharply, preparing to launch into a counterattack. But Barron wasn't finished. He took a step forward, his presence commanding. You see, Professor, the problem isn't faith itself, Barron continued. The problem is your unwillingness to acknowledge your own. You ridicule those who believe in God as intellectually inferior, yet you put blind faith in your own assumptions. You demand proof from others while providing none for your own absolute assertions. And the most ironic part? The very field you hold up as the ultimate authority, science, is filled with brilliant minds who have recognized the limitations of human knowledge and the possibility of something greater. A murmur spread through the audience. Carter, usually so quick with his comebacks, found himself hesitating. He had been in countless debates over the years, had humiliated dozens of students who dared to defend their faith, but never had he been forced onto the defensive like this. And it was not just Barron's words that unsettled him. It was the way the students were looking at him now. The smug amusement that had filled the room earlier had vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous to his reputation: doubt. Barron pressed forward. You accuse people of believing in fairy tales, he said, but let's consider the alternative. You believe that consciousness arose from unconscious matter, that life came from non-life, that the intricate, fine-tuned laws of the universe came into existence without purpose or direction. You insist that everything is the product of randomness. Yet, you expect others to accept this explanation as the only rational one. But is it truly rational, Professor? Or is it simply an assumption you cling to because it allows you to dismiss the possibility of something greater? Carter's jaw tightened. He could feel the momentum shifting further out of his control. For years he had thrived on the assumption that religious belief was inherently weak, that faith was something only those unwilling to think critically possessed. But Barron was proving him wrong in real time, demonstrating a level of intellectual strength and confidence that Carter had never encountered in a student before. And worse, Barron was exposing the inconsistencies in his own reasoning. You argue that belief in God is a sign of lower intelligence, Barron continued, his voice calm but firm. Yet here you are, struggling to counter even basic theological arguments from a student. So which is it, Professor? Are believers truly intellectually inferior, or are you simply intellectually unprepared? The room was utterly still. A few students exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking at Carter with newfound skepticism. Professor Wallace, watching from the back of the room, leaned forward slightly, intrigued. He had warned Carter that his arrogance would eventually lead him into a confrontation he couldn't win, and now it appeared that moment had arrived. Carter let out a slow exhale, forcing himself to maintain composure. That's an interesting perspective, Barron, he said, his voice forcedly measured. But let's not mistake rhetorical cleverness for substance. Science does not require faith. It is built on evidence. Then show us the evidence, Barron replied smoothly. Provide empirical proof that life emerged from nothing. Prove beyond all doubt that consciousness is a mere byproduct of neural activity and not something greater. Demonstrate with absolute certainty that the universe, with all its complexity, is purely the result of randomness and not intentional design. Science is a process, he said. It uncovers truth over time. Just because we don't have all the answers now doesn't mean we won't in the future. Barron nodded. Exactly, and that, Professor, is faith. The silence that followed was deafening. The realization hit the students almost simultaneously. Carter had just admitted to believing in something without proof. He had spent years mocking faith, yet he had unknowingly confessed to having his own. Barron had not only exposed the flaws in Carter's arguments, but had used the professor's own logic against him. Carter knew it too. His face, once so full of smug confidence, was now tight with frustration. He had walked into this debate expecting to humiliate a student, but instead he had been forced to defend his own beliefs in ways he had never anticipated. And worse, he had been exposed in front of the very students whose respect he had always commanded. Barron let the silence stretch before delivering his final words. "Professor, the real issue here isn't science versus faith," he said. "It's arrogance versus humility. A true intellectual admits what they do not know. But you, in your certainty, have closed yourself off to the possibility that you might be wrong, and in doing so you have not championed reason. You have abandoned it." The room remained still, the weight of Barron's words settling over the audience. Carter, for the first time in his career, had no response. The weight of Barron Trump's final words hung over the lecture hall like an unshakable force. For years, Professor Carter had ruled this space with absolute intellectual dominance, tearing down religious arguments with surgical precision, reducing faith to an object of mockery, and leaving students either too intimidated to respond or too humiliated to try. But today was different. Today, he had been challenged in a way he had never anticipated, not by an emotional outburst or a desperate appeal to morality, but by calm, precise logic that had systematically dismantled his own. And the worst part? The students had seen it. The very audience he had worked so hard to impress now sat in stunned silence, not in awe of his wit, but in admiration of the young man who had just turned the entire debate on its head. Professor Carter's fingers tightened around the edges of the podium. He opened his mouth to speak, to regain control, to say something, anything, that would restore his shattered authority. But no words came. His mind, so accustomed to swift and effortless counter-arguments, now felt sluggish, grasping for a response that refused to form. Across the room, students exchanged glances, some looking at Barron with newfound respect, others watching Carter with something bordering on disappointment. The unshakable professor, the intellectual titan they had admired, had finally met his match. At the back of the room, Professor Henry Wallace allowed himself the faintest smile. He had known Carter for years, had watched him grow increasingly arrogant in his approach, using his position not to foster discussion but to crush opposing views. He had warned him that one day a student would come along who wouldn't just endure his attacks but expose the very flaws in his thinking. And now, watching Carter's visibly shaken expression, Wallace knew that day had arrived. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, but they lacked the confidence of earlier. The usual smugness that accompanied Carter's lectures had vanished. The students were not laughing at Barron. They were not laughing at faith. They were watching a debate they never expected, a debate where the side they had been told was irrational had stood stronger than the man who had claimed to embody reason. Carter exhaled sharply, forcing himself to speak. "Well," he muttered, adjusting his glasses, "let's move on." The words felt hollow, weak, an attempt to salvage what little authority remained. But everyone in the room knew the truth. The debate was over. Barron had won. As Carter fumbled to continue his lecture, flipping to the next slide on his presentation, his voice wavered in a way that had never happened before. His once commanding presence had been reduced to a man going through the motions, avoiding eye contact, his mind still processing the very public dismantling of his long-standing arguments, and the students, though they pretended to listen, weren't thinking about the lecture anymore. They were thinking about what they had just witnessed. They were thinking about Barron Trump. As the lecture came to an end, the usual rush of students gathering their belongings and shuffling out was noticeably different. The air was charged with an unusual energy, one that carried the weight of what had just transpired. Conversations hushed, eyes darted toward Barron Trump, and whispers spread like wildfire. The students who had once dismissed him as nothing more than a last name were now looking at him with newfound respect, while those who had laughed at Professor Carter's initial jabs now seemed unsure, as if they had just witnessed something that had shaken their understanding of the intellectual hierarchy they had so blindly accepted. Professor Carter, usually the last to leave, stood at his podium, staring blankly at his lecture notes. His hands were still clenched, but the confidence, the smug certainty he had always carried was gone. The man who had spent years crafting his reputation as an untouchable intellectual force had, for the first time, been confronted with a challenge he could not dismiss. He had expected Barron to crumble under pressure, to stutter out weak defenses of his faith, to provide him with yet another easy victory. But instead, Barron had done the unthinkable. He had remained calm, methodical, and relentless, turning every one of Carter's arguments against him with precision. And the worst part? He had done it in front of everyone. As Barron walked toward the exit, a voice called out, hesitant but filled with something that hadn't been there before. "Barron." He turned. A student, one of the many who had been laughing earlier, now looked at him with curiosity rather than condescension. "That was incredible," the student admitted, and before Barron could respond, others chimed in. "You actually got him to listen," one murmured. "I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that," another added. A few students even clapped quietly, not out of mockery, but out of genuine admiration. It was a moment that no one had expected, least of all Barron himself. At the back of the room, Professor Henry Wallace approached his colleague, watching as Carter continued to stare at his notes, as if searching for something, perhaps an answer he had never considered before. "Nathaniel," Wallace said softly. Carter didn't respond at first. He simply let out a slow breath, then, without looking up, muttered, "Maybe I've been wrong about a few things." Wallace studied him for a moment before giving a slight nod. "Perhaps this is an opportunity for some reflection," he suggested. Carter didn't argue. For the first time in his career, he had no desire to. Outside, as Barron stepped into the crisp air, he realized something. This was bigger than just a debate. It was more than just winning an argument. He had challenged an ideology that had been considered untouchable, had stood his ground in a room where faith was expected to be ridiculed, and had forced people, not just Carter, but the students as well, to think. Maybe, just maybe, the seeds of a real conversation had been planted, and as he walked away, he knew that this was only the beginning. The debate between Barron Trump and Professor Carter carries profound lessons that extend far beyond the walls of an academic lecture hall. It serves as a reminder that true intelligence is not measured by how loudly one speaks or how easily one dismisses opposing views, but by the ability to engage in thoughtful discourse with humility and reason. For older generations who have witnessed the rapid changes in society, this story reinforces the timeless truth that wisdom is not found in arrogance, but in the willingness to listen, reflect, and consider perspectives beyond one's own. Faith and reason have often been framed as opposites, yet history has shown that some of the greatest minds, scientists, philosophers, and leaders have found ways to reconcile belief in a higher power with intellectual inquiry. This story challenges the idea that faith is a sign of weakness. Instead, it suggests that faith, like science, is a pursuit of truth, one that requires just as much courage and openness as any scientific endeavor. For those who have spent a lifetime upholding their beliefs while being told that faith is outdated or irrelevant, Barron's stand is a powerful testament that conviction, when paired with reason, is not something to be dismissed but respected. It reminds us that standing firm in our values does not mean rejecting progress, but rather engaging with the world confidently, knowing that faith and intellect are not enemies but allies in the search for meaning. As we grow older, we pass on our experiences and values to future generations, and this story underscores the importance of equipping young minds not just with knowledge, but with the courage to question, the humility to learn, and the strength to stand for what they believe in, even in the face of overwhelming opposition.